Welcome to this update and addendum to Population at the Speed of Life, prepared specifically for Scott County, to add the newly released 2020 Census Population Count in context of 1950 to 2010 population growth dynamics, 2010 to 2020 census estimates, and 2020 to 2070 projections. Hi, I am John Lamb, producer and presenter of the Population at the Speed of Life series. I am president of East Tennessee Quality Growth, a 501c3 nonprofit organization covering the 16 counties shown on the map. This presentation is a continuing part of outreach to Scott County. The county grew unevenly decade to decade from 1950 to the most recent decennial census for 2020. The new 2020 census count has limited meaning without understanding trends and dynamics of population growth and change leading up to it. We can see the change in magnitude of growth by calculating the difference between census years. And we can graph the results as decade population change. We will focus initially on dynamics of growth and change from 1950 to 2010. And fill in 2010 to 2020 later with new census population estimates. The basic components of population growth or change were natural increase and net migration. Natural increase was based on the difference between subcomponents of births and deaths. Net migration was the difference between number of people moving into and moving out of the county. Note the variability and magnitude of population change we graphed earlier. This reflected underlying dynamics or changes in the components of growth. Part of the variability was due to natural increase. The trend of natural increase was relatively smooth, with peak in the 1950s, followed by generally continuous decrease to 2010. There were obvious gaps to be accounted. If we subtract natural increase from population growth, we can account for the differences as net migration. Added here in red. Net migration was highly variable and accounted for much of the variation of population growth. But what about 2020 and beyond? Natural increase in net migration data for 2010 to 2020, continuous with previous decades, may be published later in 2021 or early 2022. In the meantime, the U.S. Census Bureau released population estimates along with estimates for natural increase in net migration for the years 2010 to 2020 in May of 2021. Given that the estimate series covered 10 full years, summary decade figures may be created, comparable to decade figures based on prior decennial censuses and other sources of data. This allows us to approximate underlying dynamics up to 2020. Armed with this information, we can begin to imagine a near future. The county showed decrease from 2010 to 2015, recovering, but ending with an overall decrease by 2020. We can calculate the differences between estimates to show population change for the 10 years of the sequence. Notice the irregular pattern of the population change trend. The pattern was predominantly defined by variation in net migration, and by far the majority of net migration was accounted to domestic movement of people resident in the United States, with only a small portion accounted to international migration. However, the effect of net migration was mitigated by natural increase. The Census Bureau provided a 10-year trend of births and deaths to 2020, allowing us to consider the underlying components of natural increase directly. Consider first the number of babies born into the population each year. The trend was relatively flat. The number of people dying each year showed a more pronounced pattern of increase over the 10-year sequence. Graphing the two together provides a summary basis for calculating natural increase. Notice that in 4 of the 10 years, births were greater than deaths, with the remaining 6 years showing deaths greater than births. The overall effect was negative natural increase or natural decrease, reducing population growth. Graphing the summary figures for natural increase shows a slight trend, downward and progressively more negative. This continued a long-term historical trend of decrease from 1950 to 2010. We can graph population change in the two components together to see a comparative trend over 10 years. Given that this is a 10-year sequence, we can begin to imagine a near future by summing components across the 10-year span and graphing the result as an estimated full decade from 2010 to 2020. We then can add our graph of past decade trends to allow recent and near future analysis. The trend of declining natural increase continues and goes slightly negative. Net migration also shows a trend of decrease to a negligible negative amount from 2010 to 2020. This results in decrease in population change to negative for the last decade. Let us challenge our imagination and consider what a future beyond 2020 may look like. Natural increase will probably continue deeper into negative territory as the baby boom ages fully and deeper into senior years, resulting in more deaths, possibly along with a trend of lower births. Hard to say where net migration will go. It may increase, but it may also decrease or continue relatively steady, consistent with the recent decade. Whatever the case, population change may continue to decrease further into the negative, due especially to the pull downward of greater negative natural increase. This probable dynamic is reflected in official projections published in 2019 by the University of Tennessee Center for Business and Economic Research. Population change is projected to trend negative in coming decades. Thus, the county is projected to enter a phase of decreasing population over the long term. These should be considered as provisional projections until the 2020 census count can be factored into subsequent projections expected late 2021 or early 2022. But substantial differences may shift projections of future population. The three population figures used in this analysis diverged. The 2020 census count for Scott County was 21,850. The 2020 census population estimate, produced a few months prior to release of the census count, was 240 more, or 1.1% more than the census count. The 2020 projection of population released in October 2019 predated both the other figures by more than a year and showed similar divergence, being more by 267, or 1.22% more than the census count. All in all, the combined use of all three population figures and associated datasets for 2020 and beyond gave insights into population trends and dynamics from the past and into the future, but should be considered provisional until more detail is released on the 2020 census. To gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics of population growth and change in Scott County, I invite you to view the main Population at the Speed of Life video on the East Tennessee Quality Growth YouTube channel. Subscribe to this channel and click the notification button for future updates. Thank you for imagining with me.